An elderly man thought his son was taking him to a nursing home, but what happened next left him absolutely stunned. Arthur adjusted the lap blanket across his knees, his weathered hands smoothing the fabric as he stared out the car window. The familiar streets of the neighborhood where he had spent most of his life drifted past in a blur, but his mind was far away, caught in a web of worry. The muted hum of the engine filled the silence between him and his son, Mark, who sat in the driver's seat, one hand loosely gripping the wheel while the other fidgeted with the radio dial. Arthur's gaze flickered to the back seat, where a neatly packed suitcase rested beside a box of his belongings. The sight made his throat tighten. He recognized the blanket his late wife had crocheted, folded neatly at the top of the pile, and a framed photograph of their family during happier times. The edges of the photo frame were worn, much like the memories themselves, frayed from years of being handled with love. Mark broke the silence. "Nice day, isn't it, Dad? Sun's out for a change." Arthur forced a nod, his lips pressing into a thin line. He wanted to answer, to agree, but his voice felt lodged somewhere deep, buried under the weight of his thoughts. The blue skies and the golden sunlight spilling through the windshield offered little comfort. They seemed almost mocking, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his heart. He had seen the signs, a whispered phone call here, a meaningful glance between Mark and his wife there, a few questions about what he might need to get settled. He had dismissed them at first, clinging to the hope that he was overthinking it. But now, with his belongings in the back seat and no explanation from Mark about their destination, his fears felt all too real. Arthur shifted in his seat, his body stiff from age and tension. His son had always been a good man, dutiful and kind, but life had pulled him in 1,000 directions: work, his own family, the constant demands of modern living. Arthur couldn't blame him. He understood how hard it was to juggle everything. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. "I know you're busy," Arthur said suddenly, his voice breaking the fragile quiet in the car. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching the asphalt stretch into the unknown. "You've got a lot on your plate." Mark glanced at him, eyebrows knitting together in surprise. "What's that, Dad?" Arthur swallowed hard. "I'm just saying, I know it hasn't been easy, having me around. I've been trying to stay out of the way." The words felt like sandpaper against his throat. Arthur had always prided himself on his independence, on being the one to help others, not the one who needed help. But the truth was, since his wife Margaret passed 2 years ago, things had changed. He had changed. The house felt too big, the days too long, and the simplest tasks too daunting. And while Mark and his family had taken him in, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that he was a burden. "Dad, come on," Mark said, his tone light but edged with something Arthur couldn't quite place. "You're not in the way." Arthur didn't respond. He wasn't sure if Mark was trying to reassure him or himself. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the window, watching as the car turned onto a quiet street he didn't recognize. His pulse quickened. He thought of Margaret, how she used to gently scold him for overthinking things. "Don't jump to conclusions, Arthur," she'd say, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "You'll give yourself a heart attack before life even has a chance to surprise you." But this didn't feel like overthinking. It felt like inevitability. He imagined the stark hallways of a nursing home, the sterile smell of disinfectant, and the echo of wheels squeaking on tile floors. He pictured himself sitting alone in a small, unfamiliar room, surrounded by strangers instead of family. The thought made his chest ache. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the silence again. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, do you remember that time we went camping when I was a kid, up by Pine Ridge Lake?" Arthur blinked, startled by the shift in conversation. "Of course I remember. You spent half the trip trying to catch that fish with the broken reel." Mark laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Yeah, and you kept telling me to just give up and enjoy the scenery, but I wouldn't listen, would I?" "No, you wouldn't," Arthur said, his lips twitching into a small smile despite himself. "You were stubborn as a mule, still are." Mark grinned but said nothing, his eyes focused on the road. Arthur wondered why he had brought up that memory. Was it just a distraction, or was it something more, a way of softening the blow that was surely coming? The car slowed as Mark turned into a residential neighborhood. Arthur's stomach churned. These weren't the busy streets near the center of town where the nursing homes were located. This was somewhere else entirely. But where? Arthur felt a lump rising in his throat. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to know, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. "Mark," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Where are we going?" Mark hesitated, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You'll see, Dad. Just trust me, okay?" Trust him. Arthur wanted to, desperately, but trust felt like a fragile thing, worn thin by months of uncertainty and unspoken fears. He clenched his hands together in his lap, trying to steady the tremor that had started in his fingers. The car resumed its quiet hum as Mark navigated through unfamiliar streets. Arthur sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping the lap blanket, as though it were a lifeline. The silence between them felt heavy, each second stretching longer than the last. He wanted to say something, anything, to cut through the tension, but the words tangled in his throat. Arthur glanced sideways at his son. Mark's eyes were focused on the road, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. There had been a time when Arthur could read him like a book, when a slight furrow of his brow or the smallest twitch of his lips could reveal every thought swirling in his head. Now, though, Mark felt like a stranger, a man consumed by responsibilities and worries that Arthur could only guess at. "I suppose it's not easy," Arthur said, his voice breaking the silence like a crack in ice. "Having me around, I mean." Mark didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the windshield. When he finally spoke, his tone was light, almost dismissive. "You're not a problem, Dad. You know that." Arthur nodded faintly, but his heart sank. The words felt rehearsed, like a line spoken out of obligation rather than truth. He looked down at his hands, at the veins that stood out against his thin skin, at the faint tremor that had crept into his fingers over the past year. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he knew it. He wasn't sure if Mark realized how much that knowledge stung. "You've got your own life," Arthur tried again, his voice quieter this time. "Your work, the kids, the house. I know I don't make things easy." Mark glanced at him briefly, his brows knitting together. "Your family, Dad. You're not supposed to be easy." Arthur forced a smile, but the tension in his chest only grew. Family. The word felt hollow, like a concept he was barely clinging to. Since Margaret's passing, everything had shifted. The house they had shared for over 50 years had become too much for him to manage alone. At first, moving in with Mark and his family had seemed like a lifeline, but over time, Arthur had begun to feel like an unwelcome guest, an afterthought in a household already stretched thin. He turned his gaze back to the window, watching the world blur past. The city had changed so much over the years. New buildings stood where old landmarks used to be, their sleek designs a sharp contrast to the familiar comfort of the past. Arthur couldn't help but feel like the city had moved on without him, like he was an artifact from another era, misplaced and out of step. In the driver's seat, Mark fiddled with the radio, cycling through stations until he landed on a soft jazz tune. The music filled the car, but it didn't ease the tension. Arthur could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them both, but his pride held him back. He couldn't bring himself to ask the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he got into the car. "Where are we going?" The thought echoed in his mind, louder with each passing mile. He knew he should just ask. A simple question, straightforward and direct. But something stopped him, a mix of fear and stubbornness that he couldn't quite shake. What if the answer was exactly what he feared? What if Mark's reassurances were just a mask for the truth? Arthur's thoughts spiraled, his mind racing through memories and regrets. He thought of the nights he had sat alone in the guest room at Mark's house, listening to the muffled sounds of the family living their lives beyond the closed door. He thought of the moments when he had caught Mark glancing at his watch during their conversations, his body language screaming impatience, even as his words were kind. "I've been thinking," Arthur said suddenly, his voice tentative. "Maybe it's time I found a place of my own, somewhere smaller, easier to manage." Mark shot him a look, his brow furrowing. "Dad, we've talked about this. You don't need to worry about that right now." Arthur shrugged, trying to keep his tone casual. "I just don't want to get in the way. That's all. I know you've got enough to deal with." Mark sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You're not in the way. Stop saying that." The The sharpness in his voice made Arthur flinch. He fell silent, retreating into himself. The car's engine filled the void again, its steady rhythm a cruel reminder of the words left unsaid. Arthur looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. He barely recognized the man he saw there. His hair, once thick and dark, was now thin and white. His face, once strong and full of life, was lined with age and sorrow. He thought of Margaret, of how she had always been the one to bridge the gaps between him and Mark, to smooth over the rough edges of their relationship. Without her, it felt like they were both adrift, struggling to connect in a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. The car turned onto a quieter street, the buildings giving way to houses with neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences. Arthur's pulse quickened. This wasn't the bustling part of the city where the nursing homes were located. This was something else. He looked at Mark, his mouth opening to ask the question that had been burning inside him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "This neighborhood looks nice." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, it's a good area." Arthur waited, hoping for more, but Mark offered nothing else. The silence settled over them again, heavier than before. Arthur felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He thought of all the things he wanted to say, all the fears and doubts that had been building inside him. He wanted to tell Mark how much he missed Margaret, how lonely he felt without her, how scared he was of what the future might hold. But the words stayed trapped inside, buried beneath layers of pride and vulnerability. The car slowed as Mark turned into a driveway. Arthur's heart raced as he looked at the house before them. It was small but charming, with a front porch and flower boxes under the windows. It didn't look like a nursing home. It didn't look like anything he had expected. Mark put the car in park and turned to Arthur, his expression unreadable. "We're here," he said softly. Arthur stared at him, his mind racing. The suitcase in the back seat, the unfamiliar street, the house before him. It all felt like a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. He didn't know what awaited him beyond that front door. But one thing was certain, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The car sat still in the driveway, the low rumble of the engine replaced by a quiet that seemed to echo in Arthur's chest. He stared out at the house in front of them, unsure what to make of it. It was small but inviting, with light blue siding and white shutters. The flower boxes under the windows were bursting with vibrant petunias and marigolds, their colors bright even in the late afternoon sun. A porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, creaking faintly as if it were whispering some long-forgotten secret. Arthur shifted in his seat, his grip tightening on the armrest. "Mark, what is this place?" His son didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned off the car and stepped out, his movements brisk but deliberate. Arthur watched as Mark circled around to the passenger side and opened the door, extending a hand to help him out. Arthur hesitated, his pride resisting the gesture, but the stiffness in his knees forced him to accept. "Come on, Dad," Mark said, his voice steady but unreadable. "I want to show you something." Arthur stood on the driveway, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He took in the house again, his mind racing to fill in the blanks. This wasn't the sterile, impersonal facility he had feared, but it wasn't familiar either. It felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, leaving him both intrigued and apprehensive. "Is this someone's house?" Arthur asked, his voice edged with uncertainty. "I don't understand." Mark gave him a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You will," he said simply. Arthur followed his son up the short path to the front porch, his steps slow and deliberate. The scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell he had been bracing himself for. Still, his unease lingered. Every step closer to the door felt like stepping into the unknown, each one heavier than the last. When they reached the porch, Mark pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Why did Mark have a key? He looked at his son, questions piling up in his mind, but Mark had already stepped inside, gesturing for Arthur to follow. The moment he crossed the threshold, Arthur stopped in his tracks. The space before him was warm and inviting, a sharp contrast to the cold, clinical vision he dreaded. Soft light spilled from a ceiling fixture, casting a golden glow over the cozy living room. An armchair that looked strikingly like his favorite one sat near a small bookshelf filled with titles he recognized. A handmade quilt, a replica of the one Margaret had loved, was draped over the back of the chair. Every detail seemed oddly familiar, like a memory brought to life. Arthur's brow furrowed as he turned to Mark. "What is this? Why are we here?" Mark stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his expression gentle but serious. "This is for you, Dad. I've been working on it for months. It's your new home." The words hung in the air, sinking into Arthur's chest with a mix of relief and disbelief. He looked around again, his eyes darting from one detail to the next. The room felt so personal, so carefully considered, as if someone had taken the time to know him, really know him, and create a space just for him. "My new home," Arthur repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean, this isn't a—" Mark shook his head, cutting him off gently. "It's not a nursing home, Dad. I know you've been worried about that, but I also know how hard it's been for you since Mom passed. The old house is too much for you, and I didn't want you to feel like you were just a guest at our place. You deserve your own space, somewhere you can feel comfortable and independent." Arthur felt his knees weaken, and he reached out for the back of the armchair to steady himself. His mind was reeling, trying to process the words, the gesture, the thoughtfulness behind it all. He had spent weeks, months even, bracing for what he thought was inevitable, that he would be sent away, tucked out of sight in a place where he could fade quietly into the background. But this was something else entirely. Mark stepped forward, his voice softer now. "The house is just a few blocks from us. You'll have your privacy, but we'll be close by if you need anything. And the kids are already planning to visit you every weekend. They've been so excited about this, they helped with the garden, even picked out the flowers." Arthur's breath hitched as he looked back toward the door, his gaze drifting to the flower boxes outside. He could picture Mark's children, their small hands digging in the soil, their laughter filling the air as they planted the colorful blooms. The thought brought a lump to his throat. "But how did you?" Arthur began, his voice breaking. Mark smiled, his expression softening. "It wasn't just me. Emma helped too. She's the one who found the house, and we all pitched in to make it perfect for you. You're not a burden, Dad. You never have been. We just want you to be happy." Arthur sank into the armchair, his hands trembling as he ran them over the quilt draped across the back. The fabric was soft under his fingers, and he could feel the love and care woven into every stitch. He thought of Margaret, of how she had always been the heart of their family, and he felt her absence keenly in that moment. But he also felt something else, a warmth, a gratitude that filled the empty spaces she had left behind. "I don't know what to say," Arthur said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Mark replied, pulling a small key from his pocket and placing it in Arthur's hand. "This is your home now. You can make it whatever you want it to be." Arthur stared at the key, its weight solid and real in his palm. It felt like more than just a piece of metal. It felt like a second chance, a lifeline he hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time in a long time, Arthur allowed himself to smile, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He looked up at his son, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Mark nodded, his own eyes glistening. "You've done so much for me, Dad. It's the least I could do." As they sat there, the quiet house surrounding them, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't just a house. It was a home, built with love and care by the people who mattered most. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for new beginnings. Arthur sat frozen in his chair, the key still resting in his hand, as though its weight alone could anchor him to this moment. The realization of what this house was, of what it represented, coursed through him like a wave, leaving him overwhelmed and speechless. He looked up at Mark, searching his son's face for answers, for any sign that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, but all he found there was sincerity. Mark motioned for him to follow, moving further into the house. Arthur hesitated for a moment, his body feeling heavy with emotion, but curiosity and disbelief drove him to his feet. He clutched the edge of the armchair for balance, his knees still unsteady, before slowly shuffling after Mark. The hallway leading into the house was lined with photos, old family pictures that Arthur hadn't seen in years. There was one of Mark as a boy, holding a baseball bat almost as big as he was, his freckled face split in a wide grin. Another showed Margaret standing beside a much younger Arthur, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they posed in front of the Eiffel Tower on their honeymoon. Arthur's steps faltered as he recognized it, the memory of that trip crashing into him with startling clarity. "How did you find this?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. Mark glanced over his shoulder, smiling softly. "It was in the attic. Mom had tucked it away in one of those old albums. Emma thought it would look good here, and I agreed." Arthur touched the edge of the frame, his fingertips trembling as they brushed against the glass. He could almost hear Margaret's laughter, her teasing voice urging him to smile as she snapped the photo. His chest tightened, a bittersweet ache that he hadn't felt in years. Mark led him into the living room next, where Arthur stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. There, by the window, was his favorite armchair, the one he'd spent countless evenings in, reading or simply watching the world go by. It looked exactly as it had in the old house, down to the small tear in the leather armrest that Margaret had insisted gave it character. Beside it was a small wooden side table, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. "I thought you might want something familiar," Mark said, his voice breaking the silence. "I know how much you loved that chair. I couldn't leave it behind." Arthur's eyes roamed the room, taking in the other details. On the far wall hung the painting he and Margaret had bought on their honeymoon, a vivid landscape of rolling hills and vibrant wildflowers. The colors seemed brighter than he remembered, as though the painting itself had come alive in this new space. On the mantel sat the antique clock he had repaired years ago, its steady ticking filling the room like a heartbeat. "You brought all this here," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Mark turned to face him fully, his expression earnest. "Because you deserve it, Dad. I didn't want you to feel like you were being pushed aside, like you were losing everything. I know how much those things mean to you. They're part of your life, part of who you are." Arthur's throat tightened, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet his son's gaze. I thought you were taking me to a nursing home," he admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I thought I was. Too much for you." Mark stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not too much, Dad. You've never been too much. I know I haven't always done a good job of showing it, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. To all of us." Arthur swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent so many months bracing for rejection, for the feeling of being unwanted, that he hadn't allowed himself to imagine anything else. And yet here he was, standing in a home that felt like it had been built from the very fabric of his memories, of his life. It was a gift he hadn't expected, one he wasn't sure he deserved. Mark gestured for him to sit, and Arthur lowered himself back into the armchair, the familiar creak of the springs grounding him. He ran his hands over the worn leather, his fingers tracing the tear in the armrest, and felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. "I wanted to do this for you," Mark said, sitting down on the edge of the couch across from him. "I know the past couple of years haven't been easy. Losing Mom, it changed everything, but I don't want you to feel like you've lost us too. This house, it's yours, your space, your independence, but you're not alone. We're just a few blocks away." Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting Mark's for the first time. There was a sincerity there that left no room for doubt, no space for the fears that had plagued him for so long. He nodded slowly, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling, but hoping his son could see it in his face. Mark smiled, a small, genuine smile that reminded Arthur of the boy he used to be. The boy who had once clung to his father's hand during thunderstorms, who had begged him to stay just a little longer when bedtime came. That boy was still there, Arthur realized, hidden beneath the layers of adulthood and responsibility. "Thank you," Arthur said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "for all of this, for everything." Mark leaned back, a look of relief washing over his face. "You've done so much for me, Dad. It's the least I could do." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet ticking of the clock filling the room. Arthur let his gaze wander, taking in the details of the space again, the books on the shelf, the quilt draped over the armchair, the light streaming through the window. It felt like home, in a way he hadn't expected, in a way he hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time in what felt like years, Arthur allowed himself to relax, to let go of the worries and fears that had weighed him down. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't being cast aside. He was loved, deeply and unconditionally, and this house was proof of that love. As the evening light softened, Arthur leaned back in the chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. There was still so much to process, so much to take in, but for now, he let himself simply be. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Arthur sat in the armchair, the familiar creak of its worn springs under him, but his body felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. He looked at the house around him, the warm touches, the thoughtful details, and felt a wave of emotions too big to contain. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the quilt on the armrest, and he clenched them into fists to steady himself, his breathing uneven. He wanted to say something, but the words were caught in his throat, tangled in the tight knot of fear, gratitude, and shame that had been building inside him for months. He had spent so long convincing himself of the worst, of being unwanted, that this sudden, unexpected kindness felt almost unbearable. "I need a minute," Arthur said, his voice barely audible. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed as he tried to collect himself. But the harder he fought to hold back the tears, the more they threatened to spill over. Mark shifted in his seat across from him, leaning forward as if to reach out, but hesitating. "Dad," he said softly, his voice cautious. "What's going on? Talk to me." Arthur shook his head, his hands gripping the armrests now as though letting go might cause him to fall apart completely. He couldn't meet his son's gaze, couldn't let him see the raw vulnerability in his eyes. But the silence between them grew heavier, pressing down on him until it felt like he couldn't breathe. Finally, the dam broke. A sob escaped his lips, sudden and sharp, and Arthur covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking as the tears came. He hadn't cried like this in years, not even when Margaret passed. He had held it all in, telling himself he had to be strong, that there was no room for his grief or fears when everyone else seemed to need him to be steady. "I thought," he began, his voice breaking as he tried to speak. "I thought you were done with me, Mark. I thought you were sending me away." Mark's eyes widened, the words hitting him like a blow. "What? Dad, no." Arthur held up a trembling hand to stop him, forcing himself to continue before he lost his nerve. "I've seen it happen, you know. Friends, neighbors, families who think they're doing the right thing, but it's just giving up on someone, putting them somewhere out of sight, out of mind. I thought that's what I had become to you, a burden." His voice cracked on the last word, and he couldn't stop the flood of tears that followed. He hated how small he felt in that moment, how exposed, but the words kept spilling out, years of pent-up fear and doubt pouring forth in a torrent. "I didn't want to say anything," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't want to make it harder for you. I know you've got so much on your plate, and I told myself I should just accept it, that maybe it was my time to step aside. But it hurt, Mark. It hurt so much, thinking you didn't want me anymore." Mark stared at him, stunned into silence. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, caught doing something he hadn't meant to, his expression stricken with guilt. Then, without a word, he moved to his father's side and knelt down, placing a hand gently on Arthur's arm. Mark reached up and covered his father's hand with his own, his grip warm and steady. "We both could have handled this better," he said. "But I promise you, Dad, I'm not going to let you feel like that again. You mean too much to me, to all of us." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stayed there, father and son, their hands clasped as they let the weight of their emotions settle. Then slowly, Arthur leaned forward, and Mark rose to meet him, pulling his father into a firm, heartfelt embrace. Arthur clung to his son, his tears soaking into Mark's shirt, but he didn't care. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, to be held, to be seen, to feel the bond between them that had seemed so distant in recent years. In Mark's arms, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, safe. When they finally pulled back, Arthur wiped his face with a handkerchief. Mark handed him, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to compose himself. "I'm too old to be blubbering like this," he said, attempting a weak smile. Mark chuckled softly, his own eyes red and puffy. "If you are, then so am I, and I'm not ready to admit that yet." Arthur let out a small laugh, the sound breaking through the tension like sunlight after a storm. He looked around the house again, this time with fresh eyes, seeing not just the space, but the love that had gone into creating it. "This house," he said, his voice steadier now, "it's more than I ever could have asked for, Mark. Thank you." Mark smiled, his expression warm and full of relief. "You don't have to thank me, Dad. You've given me so much over the years. This was the least I could do." Arthur nodded, his heart lighter now than it had been in years. He still had so much to process, so many feelings to sort through, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. He never had been, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that. Arthur sat for a long moment after Mark's embrace, letting the warmth of the moment linger as the weight of his earlier fears ebbed away. When his heart finally slowed to a steadier rhythm, he stood, his legs steadier now, and glanced around the living room with fresh eyes. There was so much more to see, and he felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of curiosity rising within him. Mark noticed his father looking around and smiled. "Want the grand tour?" he asked, his tone lighter now. Arthur nodded, his lips twitching into the beginnings of a smile. "I think I'd like that." Mark led the way, and Arthur followed, his steps slow but deliberate. The house wasn't large, but it felt expansive with its warmth and attention to detail. Every room seemed to hold something familiar, something personal. It wasn't just a house, it was a reflection of his life, his memories, his loves. In the small but cozy dining room, Arthur's eyes landed on a shelf filled with books. He stepped closer, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to run his fingers along the spines. They were his books, dog-eared novels, biographies of inventors he had admired, and old gardening guides that Margaret used to tease him about reading as though they were thrilling mysteries. "You remembered these," Arthur said softly, glancing back at Mark. "Of course," Mark replied. "Emma helped me box them up from the old house. We thought you might like having them here." Arthur's gaze lingered on one book in particular, its cover faded, but its title still legible, The Gardener's Companion. Margaret had given it to him on their 5th anniversary, inscribing the inside cover with a simple message: "To Arthur, my partner in all things green and growing. Love, Margaret." He opened the book and found her familiar handwriting, just as he remembered it. The sight brought a lump to his throat, but this time it was a sweet ache, one filled with gratitude rather than sadness. He closed the book carefully and placed it back on the shelf, feeling its weight settle somewhere deep inside him. Mark continued into the hallway, where Arthur noticed a large photo collage hanging on the wall. He stopped to examine it, his eyes scanning the collection of images that spanned decades of family memories. There was a photo of him and Margaret on their wedding day, her smile radiant as she looked at him. Another showed Mark as a young boy, holding up a lopsided birthday cake he had insisted on decorating himself. A more recent picture showed Mark's children, their faces alight with laughter as they played in a sprinkler on a summer afternoon. "Emma made that," Mark said, his voice soft. "She thought it might make this place feel a little more like home." Arthur reached out and touched one of the frames, his fingers tracing the edges. "She's right," he murmured. "It does." They moved into the kitchen next, where the scent of fresh paint mingled with the faint aroma of the herbs that hung drying by the window. Arthur noticed a small wooden box sitting on the counter, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were recipe cards in Margaret's handwriting, her famous pot roast, her Sunday morning pancakes, even the lemon bars she always made for neighborhood bake sales. "Emma found those when we were cleaning out the kitchen," Mark said, noticing where Arthur's gaze had landed. "She said you might want to keep them close." Arthur picked up one of the cards, his thumb brushing over Margaret's neat script. He could almost hear her voice, warm and steady, explaining her little tricks for making each dish just right. The memory brought a bittersweet smile to his face. "Your mother was a better cook than I ever gave her credit for," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "She could turn a can of beans into something worthy of a 5-star restaurant," Mark chuckled. "She always said it was her secret ingredient. Love, wasn't it?" Arthur nodded, his smile deepening. "That's what she used to say, every time." They continued the tour, moving into the bedroom. Arthur stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the room that had been carefully arranged to feel familiar yet new. The bed was neatly made, with a quilt that matched the one in the living room. On the nightstand was a small lamp that had once sat in the corner of Margaret's reading nook, its stained glass shade casting a soft, warm glow. Next to it sat a framed photograph of Margaret, her smile as vibrant as ever. Arthur walked over and picked up the frame, his thumb brushing against the glass. "She'd have loved this house," he said quietly. Mark stepped closer, his voice gentle. "She would. She always wanted you to have a garden like the one outside." Arthur turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "A garden?" Mark led him to the back door, opening it with a flourish. Arthur stepped outside and felt his breath catch in his throat. There, just beyond the small patio, was a garden plot brimming with possibilities. Raised beds were lined with fresh soil, and a trellis stood ready for climbing plants. A small wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree, its shade perfect for summer afternoons. "The kids helped with this part," Mark said. "They picked out the flowers for the front, but they thought you'd like to plant your own vegetables and herbs back here." Emma said it was Mom's favorite thing to do in the spring. Arthur felt his chest tighten as he took in the scene. He could picture Margaret here, her hands dirty with soil, her face alight with the joy of nurturing something into bloom. The thought made his throat ache, but it also filled him with a quiet sense of peace. "They did this for me?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For you," Mark confirmed. "They wanted you to feel at home. We all did." Arthur sank onto the bench, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. He looked around the garden, at the house behind him, at his son standing nearby, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady now, "for all of this, for reminding me how much I still have." Mark sat beside him, his hand resting on Arthur's shoulder. "You've always had us, Dad, and you always will." Arthur looked out at the garden, the sun dipping low on the horizon and casting a golden glow over the beds. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of hope, not just for the life he had lived, but for the one still ahead of him. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains in Arthur's bedroom, casting soft patterns of light on the walls. He sat up slowly, savoring the quiet moment. The room still felt unfamiliar in some ways, but not unwelcome. The quilt draped over him, the small lamp on the nightstand, the photo of Margaret. Each detail reminded him that this space had been crafted with love, and he felt its warmth every time he opened his eyes to greet the day. Arthur swung his legs over the side of the bed, pausing to steady himself before standing. His joints protested as they always did, but there was a lightness in his step now, a subtle energy that had been missing for years. The small house around him buzzed softly with the promise of a new day, and with it, the chance to carve out a fresh rhythm for himself. In the kitchen, he brewed his coffee and leaned on the counter, watching the steam curl up from the cup. The scent was rich and familiar, grounding him. On the windowsill, a small pot of basil sprouted new leaves, one of the first plants he'd started in the garden out back. It had been years since he'd tended a garden, but he'd spent the past week rediscovering the joy of it, kneeling in the soil with the sun on his back and Margaret's memory close in his heart. After breakfast, Arthur made his way outside, donning the straw hat he'd found tucked in a corner of the closet, a thoughtful touch from Emma, he guessed. The garden awaited, its raised beds beginning to sprout the first hints of green. He knelt carefully by one of the plots, his hands steady as he checked the young shoots of spinach and carrots. The rhythm of gardening was meditative, each small task grounding him in the present. As he worked, the sound of giggles drifted through the air, and he looked up to see Mark's two children racing across the lawn toward him. "Grandpa!" they called in unison, their faces alight with excitement. Arthur chuckled and set down his trowel, rising to greet them. "Well, now what's all this commotion about? You two planning to trample my vegetables?" The younger one, Ella, threw her arms around his waist, her grin wide and toothy. "Daddy said we could come help you today." Her older brother, Sam, nodded earnestly, holding up a small watering can. "I brought this for the flowers." Arthur's heart swelled as he ruffled their hair. "Well, aren't I lucky to have such fine helpers? Let's see what kind of mischief we can get into." The morning passed in a blur of laughter and small, meaningful moments. Ella insisted on planting marigolds, her hands covered in dirt as she carefully patted the soil around the seedlings. Sam took charge of the watering, his serious expression making Arthur smile. Together, they turned the garden into a lively, joyful space, the air filled with their chatter and Arthur's occasional chuckles. When Mark arrived later, carrying a bag of sandwiches for lunch, Arthur felt a familiar warmth settle over him. They ate together on the patio, the kids munching happily as Mark and Arthur chatted. Their conversations had become easier, more fluid, as though the walls that had once stood between them had crumbled. "I see the garden's coming along nicely," Mark said, gesturing toward the rows of young plants. Arthur nodded, his gaze soft. "It's been good to get my hands back in the dirt. Reminds me of the days when your mother and I used to spend entire weekends planting and pruning. She always said the garden was her sanctuary." Mark's expression grew thoughtful. "I think she'd be proud seeing you out there again." Arthur smiled, the ache of missing Margaret now accompanied by the comfort of knowing she was still a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life. "I think she would too." In the weeks that followed, Arthur began to settle into his new routine. The house quickly became a home, each day bringing new moments of discovery and connection. He spent mornings in the garden, his hands growing surer with each task. Afternoons were for woodworking, a hobby he'd put aside years ago but found himself drawn to again. The small workshop Mark had set up in the garage was modest but well-equipped, and Arthur felt a deep satisfaction each time he shaped a piece of wood into something useful. His evenings often brought visits from Mark and the kids. They would sit on the porch swing, the gentle creak of the chains a soothing backdrop to their conversations. Ella loved to listen to Arthur's stories, her wide eyes fixed on him as he recounted tales of his youth. Sam, quieter but just as engaged, often asked thoughtful questions, and Arthur marveled at the boy's curiosity. Mark, true to his promise, stopped by daily, even if only for a few minutes. Sometimes he brought groceries or fixed a stubborn hinge on the screen door. Other times, he simply sat with Arthur, sharing a cup of coffee and talking about nothing in particular. Their bond grew stronger with each visit, the lingering tension between them fading into the background. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Arthur sat alone on the porch swing, watching the garden bathed in golden light. The scent of lavender and fresh soil filled the air, and the distant hum of crickets began to rise. He let out a long breath, his hands resting on his knees as he reflected on the past few weeks. This house, this garden, this life, it was a gift he hadn't expected. But more than that, it was a reminder of the love that surrounded him. A love he had doubted but now felt in every detail of his days. He had spent so long fearing that he was a burden, that his time had passed, but this new chapter had shown him otherwise. He still had so much to give, so much to share, and his family had given him the space to do just that. Arthur leaned back, letting the swing sway gently beneath him. He thought of Margaret, of her laughter, her kindness, her way of seeing beauty in even the smallest things. He could almost hear her voice, whispering encouragement, telling him to keep going, to embrace this new beginning. And he would. For her, for himself, for the family that had shown him the depth of their love. He would keep planting, building, laughing, and living. The past was a part of him, but so was the future. And for the first time in years, Arthur felt ready to embrace it fully. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to appear, Arthur closed his eyes and smiled. This was his sanctuary now, a place where memories and hope intertwined, where he could grow and thrive. It wasn't just a new beginning, it was a continuation of all the love that had come before, a testament to the bonds that time could never break. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the garden, casting long shadows over the rows of spinach, carrots, and marigolds. Arthur sat on the porch swing, his hands resting on the smooth wooden armrests, the faint creak of the chains a comforting rhythm. The day had been long but satisfying. He had spent the morning repairing a birdhouse with Sam and the afternoon teaching Ella how to plant basil. Now, as the cool evening air settled over the house, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, the lavender releasing its calming fragrance as dusk fell. Arthur's gaze traveled over the yard, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. He thought of the life he had rebuilt here, of the countless small moments that had begun to reshape his days into something vibrant and fulfilling. This place, this life, it was more than he had imagined when he first stepped through the door. The familiar sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned his head to see Mark's car pulling into the driveway. The sight of his son stepping out, with Ella and Sam bounding from the back seat, brought an unbidden smile to Arthur's face. Mark waved as he approached, the kids already sprinting ahead to climb onto the porch. "Grandpa!" Ella shouted, her voice bright and filled with excitement. She leapt onto the swing beside him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Guess what? I made a picture for you at school today." Arthur chuckled, brushing a hand over her wild curls. "Is that so? Well, I can't wait to see it." Sam climbed up on the other side of the swing, more reserved but just as eager. "I helped Dad fix the fence this afternoon," he announced proudly. It was loose by the driveway. "Good man," Arthur said, nodding with approval. "You're turning into quite the handyman, just like your father." Mark joined them, carrying a small picnic basket in one hand and a blanket draped over his arm. "We thought we'd bring dinner over," he said, setting the basket down on the porch. "Emma wanted me to make sure you actually ate something tonight." Arthur rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "She acts like I don't know how to take care of myself." "She just worries," Mark said with a grin. "You know how she is." The family settled on the porch, the kids spreading out the blanket while Mark unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of hot tea. Arthur watched them with quiet contentment, marveling at how effortlessly they filled the space with life and warmth. The children's laughter rang out as Ella teased Sam about spilling crumbs, and Mark chimed in with a story about their day, his voice carrying the easy cadence of someone who had finally found balance. As the meal wound down, the conversation turned to memories, as it often did on evenings like this. Mark shared stories from his childhood, recalling camping trips and family holidays with a vividness that made Arthur laugh out loud. Ella listened with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting with questions, while Sam leaned against his grandfather, soaking in the tales. "You remember the time you tried to fix the washing machine and flooded the entire kitchen?" Mark said, his grin widening. Arthur groaned, shaking his head. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" "Not a chance," Mark replied, his laughter contagious. They sat together as the sun dipped lower, the sky fading to a soft lavender streaked with pink and orange. The stars began to peek out one by one, and the air grew cooler, though none of them seemed eager to move inside. The swing swayed gently, cradling them in its familiar rhythm. Arthur's gaze wandered to the garden, the faint outlines of the plants now visible only in the soft glow of the porch light. He thought of Margaret then, her presence as vivid in his mind as if she were sitting beside him. She had always loved evenings like this, with the family gathered close, the world quiet and full of peace. He could almost hear her voice, hear her teasing him about the washing machine or gently reminding him to water the flowers before bed. A wave of gratitude washed over him, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He had been so wrong, he realized, about Mark, about everything. He had spent so much time fearing the worst, bracing for rejection, that he hadn't allowed himself to see the love that had been there all along. This house, this life, it was a testament to that love, to the care and thoughtfulness that Mark and his family had poured into ensuring he felt not just cared for, but cherished. Arthur leaned back on the swing, his hands resting on Ella's and Sam's shoulders, his heart full. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, he tilted his head back and looked up at the stars, their soft twinkle, a reminder of how small but connected everything in life truly was. He thought of Margaret again, silently thanking her for raising a son who had turned out to be so kind, so selfless, so capable of giving. She had always believed in Mark, even when Arthur's doubts had crept in. And now, sitting here with his family, Arthur saw what she had seen all along. "Grandpa, what are you thinking about?" Ella asked, her voice breaking through his reverie. Arthur smiled down at her, his eyes twinkling. "Oh, just how lucky I am." Ella giggled, leaning her head against his arm. "We're lucky too, Grandpa." Mark, who had been quiet, glanced over at his father. Their eyes met, and for a moment, no words were needed. There was an understanding between them now, a bridge that had been rebuilt and strengthened through love and effort. The evening stretched on, the swing swaying gently as they lingered in each other's company. Arthur felt no rush, no pull to do anything but sit here, surrounded by the people who mattered most. The fears and doubts that had once haunted him felt like a distant memory, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. As the stars filled the sky and the children's laughter began to fade into sleepy murmurs, Arthur closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the swing and the soft murmur of voices wash over him. This, he thought, was what home truly felt like. Not just the walls and the furniture, but the people, the memories, the love that turned a house into a sanctuary. When he opened his eyes again, Mark was looking at him with a quiet smile. "You okay, Dad?" Arthur nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Better than okay. I'm home." Arthur's story reminds us that love isn't just about grand gestures. It's about the small, thoughtful actions that show someone they're valued. In a world that often moves too fast, it's easy to overlook the quiet ways we can make each other feel truly at home. Arthur's journey teaches us the power of family, of listening, and of creating space for one another to grow. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of what love and connection really mean. And if you've ever felt inspired by your own family's acts of kindness or have a story like Arthur's, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that uplifts and inspires. Together, let's celebrate the moments that bring us closer and the people who make our lives brighter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.